I was recently in Israel, in Jerusalem often, and throughout the country, anti-Muslim sentiment is palpable. The Christians, however, seem to get a free pass. And I don't know whether that's simply because of tourism or whether there's some other thing going on there. But something that puzzles me and feels like a dark space that I just don't understand is evangelical agitation and or support within Israel today, having something to do with end times and apocalyptic scriptures. And I wonder, can you help clarify for me what the hell they're doing?
Sure.
And how where the free pass comes from?
I've written a lot about this, by the way, in my second book, which is in paperback, is Beyond Fundamentalism. First of all, let me say that Christians don't get a free pass in the occupied territories. They do in Israel proper, but in the last decade, there have been 29 cases of arson, vandalism, and outright destruction of Christian churches and monasteries in the occupied territories as a result of what is referred to now as price tag terrorism. This is a group of radical Jewish settlers who believe, of course, that their loyalty is not to the secular state of Israel, but to the biblical land of Israel, who are trying to rebuild the kingdom of David, and to do so, they have to cleanse that land of all non-Jews. And they've made life absolutely miserable for Palestinian Christians in the occupied territories. But you're right, in Israel proper, yes, thanks largely to an enormous amount of money that is coming from Christians around the world, you have a completely different situation there. So I'm going to give you the very, very quick version of this, because I do want to get one more question before we run out of time. Okay, so the temple in the year 70, in the year 66, the Jews rose up against the Romans, miraculously managed to kick Rome out of Jerusalem, keep them at bay for about 4 years, mostly because Rome was dealing with its own civil war, and to them, the Jews were just a flea on their back that they didn't even worry about, until they finished their civil war, and then they realized, oh, right, the Jews, let's go kill them too. So they came back, they killed everyone. Nearly 1 million Jews were slaughtered, if you believe Josephus. They burned the city of Jerusalem and the temple, the actual living, dwelling place of the Spirit of God, literal dwelling place of the Spirit of God, to the ground, defiled its ashes, renamed the city eventually Aelia Capitolina. Josephus says that when they were done, you would never guess there was a city called Jerusalem. And then what Jews remained were exiled out of the Holy Land. This was, of course, an apocalyptic moment. And so this notion started to arise both in Judaism and in Christianity separately, interestingly, on separate tracks, that the return of the Messiah, or in the case of the Jews, the advent of the Messiah, because they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, would be predicated on the rebuilding of that temple. That if they can just rebuild the third temple, the Jews say, the Messiah will arrive. And Christians say, well, the Messiah already arrived. He'll just come back if we rebuild the temple. The problem, of course, is around the 7th century, Jerusalem became an Islamic land, and the Dome of the Rock was built atop there, and that Dome of the Rock still exists, and the temple is still under the authority of the Waqf, the Islamic authority in Jerusalem. So there is no third temple building unless you destroy the dome first. And so you have this, over the last 50 years, this fascinating collusion between right-wing Christian evangelicals in the U.S. and right-wing Jewish fanatics in Israel, who have nothing in common with each other except for this, to tear down that temple. And there's been at least 3 thwarted attacks against the Dome of the Rock. One, which in 1992, very, very famously, I mean, it was just a total accident that some janitor discovered bombs that were encircling the Dome of the Rock and alerted the authorities to tear that thing down, rebuild the third temple. Now, here's the weird thing about it, is that for Christians who are essentially the money behind it, they're the ones who send all the money. And for Jews who are actually doing the work on the ground there, they have this cooperation, but theologically that cooperation doesn't work because according to Christianity, the first thing that Jesus does when he comes back is get rid of the Jews. Now, the Jews obviously don't believe that. They don't really pay any attention to it. And so for them, they're more than happy to take all of this money and to build things like the Temple Institute, etc., which overlooks the Temple Mount today, in order to, essentially get rid of the Muslims and rebuild this temple and to consecrate the land for the Messiah. So yeah, it's a weird fellowship. It's a weird bedfellows, but it is what it is. Do I have to stop even though we started a little bit late? Or can I get one more question?